You feel overwhelmed by the constant pressure to make perfect decisions while everyone around you seems paralyzed by indecision and doubt. Every choice feels like it carries the weight of the world, yet you watch others confidently navigate their challenges while you second-guess yourself into mediocrity, wondering if you'll ever develop the mental fortitude to lead with true conviction. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled the most powerful empire in history while maintaining inner peace through the darkest of times. For 19 years, I bore the weight of 60 million lives, made decisions that shaped the known world, and developed the mental discipline that transforms ordinary thinking into imperial wisdom. The Stoic principles I'll share will teach you to think with the clarity and conviction of an emperor, giving you the mental framework to make decisions with unshakable confidence, regardless of external pressures. The same philosophy that guided me through plagues, wars, and the crushing responsibility of absolute power will transform how you approach every challenge in your modern life. Take the first step by liking this video, subscribing for more ancient wisdom applied to modern challenges, and sharing your location in the comments. I want to see which cities and countries are ready to develop an emperor's mindset. I never wanted to be emperor. When I was 17, I was perfectly content studying philosophy, wrestling with abstract concepts, and living the quiet life of intellectual pursuit. My passion was Stoicism, the idea that we could find peace through wisdom and virtue. I spent my days reading Epictetus, debating with my teachers, and believing that the highest life was one of contemplation, far removed from the messy complications of politics and power. Then Emperor Antoninus Pius changed everything. In one fateful conversation, he told me I would be his adopted son and heir to the Roman Empire. I remember standing in his study, surrounded by maps of territories I would one day govern, feeling the weight of 60 million lives suddenly pressing down on my shoulders. The adoption scroll he placed before me wasn't just a legal document, it was a complete transformation of my identity and future. My first reaction was to argue. I told him I wasn't suited for rule, that my temperament was contemplative, not commanding. I explained that I preferred books to battles, philosophy to politics. But Antoninus looked at me with those penetrating eyes and said something that changed my understanding forever. Marcus, the empire doesn't need another warrior. It needs a philosopher who can think like an emperor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the imperial gardens, grappling with the terrifying realization that my peaceful life of study was ending. The responsibility felt overwhelming. How could someone who had never commanded anything more than his own thoughts suddenly be expected to command the known world? I felt like I was drowning in an ocean of duty I never chose. But as I wrestled with this unwanted destiny, I began to understand something profound about leadership and thinking. The very reluctance I felt, the hesitation and self-doubt, were actually signs that I might be suited for power precisely because I didn't hunger for it. Those who desperately want authority are often the least qualified to wield it wisely. I spent the next 23 years learning to be emperor under Antoninus' guidance. During this time, I discovered that imperial thinking isn't about wanting power, it's about accepting responsibility for others when you'd rather focus on yourself. Every lesson in governance became a lesson in philosophy, and every philosophical principle became a tool for better leadership. The transformation wasn't immediate. For years, I struggled with the tension between my desire for private contemplation and my public duties. I would steal moments for philosophical reflection between administrative meetings, writing thoughts in the margins of state documents. I learned to find peace in the storm of constant decision-making. What I discovered during those preparation years was that thinking like an emperor starts with accepting what you don't want. The moment I stopped resisting my destiny and started embracing the challenge, everything changed. I began to see that the same intellectual rigor I applied to philosophical problems could be applied to governing people. The same pursuit of wisdom that drove my studies could drive my leadership. By the time I actually became emperor at 39, I understood the fundamental truth that would guide my entire reign. The best leaders are often those who never sought leadership but accepted it as their duty. Imperial thinking begins with service, not ambition. It starts with the recognition that your life is no longer entirely your own, that your thoughts, decisions, and actions must serve something larger than your personal preferences. This is the first lesson I want you to understand about thinking like an emperor. True authority comes not from grabbing power, but from accepting responsibility you didn't choose. When you stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "How can I serve?" your entire approach to challenges transforms. You begin to think beyond your own comfort, beyond your own desires, and start considering the greater good in every decision you make. The day I first wore the purple imperial cloak, I understood what it meant to carry the weight of absolute responsibility. The fabric itself was magnificent deep purple dye that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, woven with golden threads that caught the light like captured sunlight. But the moment it settled on my shoulders, I felt something far heavier than cloth. The crushing realization that every decision I made would ripple through 60 million lives. I was 39 years old, standing in the Senate House as senators formally acknowledged my authority. The ceremony was elaborate incense burning, prayers to the gods, speeches about my worthiness to rule. But all I could think about was the weight. Not the physical weight of the purple cloak, but the metaphysical weight of absolute power over human destiny. That first night as emperor, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the imperial palace, past guards who now snapped to attention at my approach, past servants who bowed as if I were a god. The marble corridors echoed with my footsteps, and with each step I felt the magnitude of what I had inherited. These weren't just buildings, they were the center of the known world. From these rooms, decisions would flow that would determine whether armies marched, whether provinces prospered, whether justice or injustice prevailed across continents. The purple cloak hung in my chambers like a silent reminder. In those early days, I would stare at it each morning, knowing that putting it on meant accepting that my personal desires no longer mattered. My breakfast preferences, my sleep schedule, my wish for quiet contemplation, all of these became secondary to the needs of the empire. The moment you think like an emperor, you realize that your life is no longer your own. I remember the first major decision I had to make, a dispute between two provinces over water rights. On the surface, it seemed like a simple administrative matter, but as I studied the issue, I realized that my choice would determine whether thousands of farmers could irrigate their crops, whether cities would have clean drinking water, whether entire regions would prosper or decline. The purple cloak suddenly felt heavier that day. What I learned in those early months was that authority without wisdom is nothing more than tyranny dressed in fancy clothes. The purple doesn't make you an emperor, your thinking does. Anyone can wear the cloak, but only someone who truly understands the weight of responsibility can wear it worthily. I developed a daily practice that would serve me throughout my reign. Each morning, before donning the purple, I would spend time in philosophical reflection. I would remind myself that the cloak was not a symbol of my power, but of my duty. It wasn't about what I could do, but about what I should do. The emperor's mind must be calibrated not to personal gain, but to universal good. The transformation in my thinking was profound. Before becoming emperor, when I faced a problem, I could consider only how it affected me. Now, every decision required me to think in concentric circles how it affected my family, my advisors, the people of Rome, the provinces, future generations, even our enemies. The emperor's perspective is always expanding outward, never contracting inward. I noticed how this broader thinking changed even small daily interactions. When a servant made a mistake, I couldn't simply react with irritation. I had to consider how my response would affect not just that person, but how it would be interpreted by others who witnessed it, how it would reflect on imperial justice, how it would influence the culture of the palace. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression carried imperial weight. The purple taught me that thinking like an emperor means thinking beyond yourself in every situation. Whether you're leading a family, managing a business, or simply trying to live a meaningful life, the moment you accept responsibility for others' well-being, you begin to develop imperial thinking. You start to see how your decisions create ripple effects that extend far beyond your immediate circumstances. This broader perspective doesn't come naturally, must be cultivated daily. I learned to ask myself different questions. Not what do I want, but what does the situation require? Not how does this benefit me, but how does this serve the greater good? Not what's the easiest path, but what's the right path, regardless of difficulty. The weight of the purple never gets lighter, you simply get stronger at carrying it. Imperial thinking means accepting that your comfort, your convenience, your personal preferences matter less than your responsibility to others. When you truly embrace this mindset, something remarkable happens. The burden transforms into purpose, and the weight becomes the very thing that gives your life meaning and direction. In my 3rd year as emperor, during a particularly brutal winter when Germanic tribes were threatening our borders and plague was spreading through the eastern provinces, I made a discovery that would transform not just my reign, but my entire understanding of power. I realized that all the external authority in the world meant nothing if I couldn't maintain sovereignty over my own mind. I had been writing in my personal journal thoughts and reflections I never intended anyone else to read. These writings, which would later be called my meditations, were my way of working through the constant pressures of imperial life. On this particular evening, by lamplight in my private study, I wrote a phrase that would become central to my philosophy. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That night, I understood what the Stoics meant by the inner citadel, the fortress of the mind that no external force can breach. An emperor might command armies, but if he cannot command his own thoughts and emotions, he is powerless. A man might own vast territories, but if he cannot govern his own reactions to circumstances, he is enslaved. True imperial thinking begins with establishing unassailable sovereignty over your inner world. I began developing what I called my morning and evening philosophical exercises. Each dawn, before the demands of governance could crowd my mind, I would spend time fortifying my mental defenses. I would remind myself of what was within my control, my judgments, my responses, my choices, and what was not other people's actions. Natural disasters, the outcomes of events I had set in motion. The morning exercise became a ritual of mental preparation. I would sit quietly and remind myself, today I will meet interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. This wasn't pessimism, was imperial realism. By acknowledging that difficult people and challenging situations were inevitable, I could prepare my mind to respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion. But the real power came from the evening reflection. Each night, I would review the day's events, not to judge myself harshly, but to learn from my responses. When had I acted from wisdom? When had I been driven by emotion? Where had I maintained my inner citadel? And where had I allowed external circumstances to breach my mental walls? I remember one evening when a trusted advisor had betrayed my confidence and shared sensitive information with political rivals. My first reaction was Raggy felt the heat of anger rising in my chest, the desire for immediate retribution, but then I retreated to my inner citadel. I asked myself, what is actually within my control here? Can I control his past betrayal? No. Can I control my response? Absolutely. This mental discipline became the foundation of imperial thinking. I learned to create space between stimulus and response, between what happened to me and how I chose to interpret and react to it. In that space, that inner citadel, lay all my real power as both emperor and human being. The practice of building this inner fortress required daily attention. I developed specific mental exercises. When faced with frustrating people, I would remind myself that they were acting according to their understanding of good, even if that understanding was flawed. When confronted with setbacks, I would ask what this obstacle could teach me. When dealing with criticism or praise, I would remember that neither could touch my essential self unless I permitted it. I discovered that the stronger my inner citadel became, the more effective I was as emperor. When senators disagreed with my policies, I could listen without defensiveness. When military campaigns faced setbacks, I could adjust strategy without despair. When plagues and famines tested the empire, I could lead with steady confidence instead of panic. The inner citadel taught me that imperial thinking isn't about controlling external circumstances. It's about maintaining complete authority over your internal responses. A true emperor recognizes that while he cannot control what happens, he has absolute sovereignty over what those events mean and how he chooses to respond. This mental discipline creates what I call philosophical distance. You learn to observe your own thoughts and emotions as if from above, like a general surveying a battlefield. You can see your anger, your fear, your desires, but you're not controlled by them. You can acknowledge these feelings without being enslaved by them. I practiced this during state meetings, watching my own reactions to advisors' suggestions, to bad news from the provinces, to requests for resources we didn't have. I would notice my initial emotional response, frustration, worry, irritation, then consciously choose my actual response based on wisdom rather than feeling. The result was a kind of inner freedom that no external circumstance could touch. Enemies could threaten the empire, but they couldn't threaten my peace of mind. Advisors could disappoint me, but they couldn't destroy my confidence. Setbacks could delay my plans, but they couldn't defeat my resolve. Building your own inner citadel starts with daily practice. Begin each day by reminding yourself what is and isn't within your control. End each day by reviewing not what happened to you, but how you responded to what happened. In between, practice creating space between events and reactions, between other people's actions and your emotional responses. Remember, external events have only the power you give them. Your inner citadel, your ability to choose your thoughts, responses, and attitudes is the one territory where you can be an absolute emperor, regardless of your position in the world. The true test of imperial thinking came not in the comfortable chambers of the palace, but in the mud and blood of the Germanic frontier. For years, barbarian tribes had been pressing against our borders, and finally, I had to leave Rome to lead the legions personally. It was one thing to make philosophical decisions about grain, distributions and tax policies. It was another to make life and death choices. While arrows whistled overhead and men screamed in pain around me, I remember my first major battlefield decision with absolute clarity. We were facing a confederation of Marcomanni and Quadi tribes who had crossed the Danube in force. My generals were arguing. Some wanted to attack immediately while we had numerical advantage. Others insisted we should wait for reinforcements from Gaul. As they debated, I could see our soldiers watching me, waiting for their emperor to decide whether they would live or die in the next few hours. In that moment, I understood what it truly meant to think like an emperor under pressure. The philosophical principles I had developed in peaceful meditation suddenly had to function in chaos. My inner citadel had to remain stable while everything around me was violent uncertainty. I closed my eyes for just a moment and applied the discipline I had practiced countless times in my private study. First, I separated what I could control from what I couldn't. I couldn't control the enemy's numbers or their tactical decisions. I couldn't control the weather or the terrain, but I could control my judgment, my timing, and the clarity of my commands. I made the decision to wait not from fear, but from strategic patience. My reasoning was simple. The enemy had crossed into our territory, far from their supply lines. Time favored us, not them. While my generals saw delay as weakness, I saw it as strength. We would let the barbarians exhaust themselves against our defensive positions while our reinforcements arrived. The decision was unpopular with some of my commanders, who interpreted strategic patience as timidity. But imperial thinking requires the courage to be misunderstood, especially when lives hang in the balance. A true emperor makes decisions based on wisdom, not on the need to appear decisive to others. Over the following days, as we held our positions, I watched how pressure reveals the difference between reactive thinking and imperial thinking. Reactive thinking says, we must do something now because people are watching. Imperial thinking says, we must do the right thing at the right time, regardless of how it appears to others. When the reinforcements arrived and we finally engaged the enemy, our strategic patience paid off. The barbarians were weakened by days of futile attacks against our fortifications, demoralized by our refusal to be drawn into hasty action. What could have been a costly frontal assault became a decisive victory with minimal Roman casualties. But the real lesson came later. During the long campaigns that followed, I learned that maintaining clarity of thought while under extreme pressure requires specific mental disciplines. When chaos surrounds you, when people are shouting conflicting advice, when the stakes are highest, that's when your preparation in peaceful moments pays off. I developed what I called the Emperor's Pause, a brief moment of philosophical reflection before any major decision. Even in battle, I would take 3 breaths and ask myself, what does wisdom require here? What would serve the greater good? What decision will I be proud of when the immediate pressure passes? This practice saved me from countless mistakes born of urgency rather than thought. I watched other leaders make snap decisions under pressure, then spend months dealing with the consequences. Imperial thinking means understanding that most situations that feel urgent actually allow time for proper reflection, even if that time is measured in heartbeats rather than hours. During one particularly difficult siege, when our water supplies were running low and disease was spreading through the camp, my advisors urged me to accept an unfavorable peace treaty. The pressure to end the suffering was enormous, but I realized that what appeared to be compassion for my soldiers would actually be cruelty to future generations of Romans who would have to fight these same battles again if we settled for an inadequate peace. This taught me perhaps the most important aspect of decision-making under pressure. True imperial thinking considers not just immediate consequences, but long-term effects. You must ask not only what will this decision do now, but what will this decision lead to in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? The Germanic campaigns lasted for years, with constant decisions about battle tactics, diplomatic negotiations, resource allocation, and personnel management. Each choice had to be made while balancing immediate military needs with long-term imperial strategy. While considering the welfare of my soldiers alongside the security of the empire, I learned that pressure doesn't have to cloud judgment, can actually clarify it. If you've trained your mind properly, when stakes are highest, superficial considerations fall away and essential priorities become crystal clear. The emperor's mind under pressure becomes like a focused beam of light, cutting through confusion to illuminate what truly matters. key is preparation before pressure arrives. You cannot develop imperial thinking in the middle of a crisis. You must build these mental muscles during peaceful times so they're strong when you need them most. Practice making thoughtful decisions about small matters so you're ready to make wise decisions about large ones. Remember, pressure reveals character. It doesn't create it. The emperor's ability to think clearly under fire comes from daily discipline in thinking clearly when the stakes are low. Build your mental fortress in peacetime, and it will protect you when the battles come. Nothing prepares you for governing. During the end of the world, when the plague that would bear my name swept through the empire, killing an estimated 5 million people, I faced decisions that no amount of philosophical training could have anticipated. This wasn't about military strategy or political maneuvering. This was about maintaining hope and direction when civilization itself seemed to be dissolving. The disease came back with our returning armies from the eastern campaigns, spreading like wildfire through trade routes that had once been the empire's strength. Within months, entire cities were decimated. Rome itself lost nearly a third of its population. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be burned or buried. The very air seemed poisoned with death and despair. I remember the morning when my closest advisor told me that we had lost contact with 7 major cities, not because of rebellion or invasion, but because there simply weren't enough living people left to send messages. Standing in my study, looking at maps that suddenly represented not territories but graveyards, I felt the full weight of imperial responsibility in a way I never had before. The easy choice would have been to retreat to some distant, unaffected provenance and wait out the catastrophe. Many senators urged exactly this course, arguing that the emperor's survival was more important than his presence during the crisis. But I realized that this was precisely when imperial thinking mattered most, not when times were good, but when they were impossible. I made the decision to remain in Rome and personally oversee the empire's response to the plague. This wasn't heroic posturing, it was a calculated choice based on imperial logic. If the emperor fled from the capital during its darkest hour, what message would that send to provincial governors, to military commanders, to ordinary citizens? Leadership isn't just about making good decisions. It's about being present when those decisions need to be implemented. The plague years taught me that imperial thinking must function even when normal logic breaks down. How do you allocate scarce medical supplies when every choice means condemning some people to death to save others? How do you maintain civil order when fear makes people irrational? How do you project confidence about the future when you genuinely don't know if there will be a future? I developed what I called catastrophe clarity, the ability to see clearly, precisely, because circumstances were so extreme that all non-essential considerations fell away. When Rome was dying, questions about political advantage, personal comfort, or popular opinion became irrelevant. Only one question mattered: what actions will save the most lives and preserve the most essential functions of civilization? This crisis thinking required me to make decisions that seemed impossible. I had to choose which cities would receive limited medical supplies, knowing that cities I didn't choose would suffer higher death rates. I had to maintain trade routes that were spreading the disease because stopping them would cause famine. I had to keep the army functioning even as soldiers died in massive numbers, because without military order, the plague would have been followed by complete social collapse. The most difficult decision came when the plague reached my own household. Several members of my family fell ill, including my wife Faustina. My advisors begged me to focus on protecting the imperial family, to bring the best physicians to the palace and seal ourselves off from the contaminated city. But I realized that if the emperor's family received better treatment than ordinary citizens during a plague, it would destroy the moral authority upon which the empire rested. I chose to give my family the same level of medical care available to other Romans, no more, no less. When Faustina died, along with several of my children, I grieved as a husband and father, but I governed as an emperor. Personal loss could not be allowed to cloud imperial judgment or distract from the decisions that still needed to be made. For millions of other families facing the same losses, the plague years taught me that imperial thinking means maintaining perspective during chaos. When everyone around you is paralyzed by the magnitude of a crisis, you must be the one who breaks the overwhelming problem into manageable pieces. I learned to focus not on the total death toll, a number too large to process, but on the specific decisions I could make each day to reduce suffering and maintain hope. I established daily routines that helped maintain both my own stability and the empire's functionality. Each morning, I would receive reports from affected regions, make resource allocation decisions, and issue clear instructions to provincial governors. Each evening, I would review what had worked and what hadn't, adjusting strategies based on new information. This rhythm of information, decision, action, and reflection became the empire's heartbeat during the plague years. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that leadership during catastrophe requires honest communication about uncertainty. I couldn't promise my people that the plague would end quickly, because I didn't know when it would end. But I could promise them that their emperor would continue making the best possible decisions with available information, would not abandon his post, and would work tirelessly to preserve what could be preserved and rebuild what could be rebuilt. The plague eventually passed, but the lessons remained. I had learned that imperial thinking must function not just during good times and normal challenges, but during scenarios that feel like the end of everything. You must be able to make rational decisions when emotions are screaming, to maintain hope when evidence suggests despair, and to project confidence when you feel uncertain. Crisis reveals whether your leadership principles are real or just comfortable theories, when everything you've built seems to be crumbling, when normal solutions don't work, when the very foundations of order are shaking. That's when imperial thinking proves its worth. The emperor's mind must be the one fixed point of stability in a world of chaos, the lighthouse that helps others navigate when all familiar landmarks have disappeared. The hardest lesson I learned as emperor wasn't about commanding armies or managing provinces. It was about mastering my own desires. When you possess absolute power, every want can become reality with a simple command. I could have any luxury, any pleasure, any experience the ancient world could provide. The discipline required to want less rather than more became the foundation of my imperial thinking. I discovered this principle during my 4th year as emperor, when a particularly challenging harvest season created grain shortages throughout the empire. While my advisors debated distribution strategies, I found myself in my private chambers, looking at my elaborate dinner spread, exotic foods imported from across the known world, prepared by the finest cooks, served on golden plates. The contrast was jarring. My citizens were rationing bread while I was deciding between 12 different types of wine. That night, I made a decision that would reshape my understanding of imperial power. I gave orders that my personal meals would mirror the rations available to ordinary citizens during the shortage. If Rome was eating barley instead of wheat, so would I if the provinces had limited meat. My table would reflect that limitation. My servants thought I had lost my mind, but I was actually finding it. This practice taught me what the Stoics called the discipline of desire, the revolutionary idea that wanting what happens is more powerful than making happen what you want. An emperor who needs external circumstances to align with his preferences is slave to those circumstances. An emperor who can find contentment with whatever circumstances arise is truly free. I began practicing voluntary discomfort as a mental exercise. Once a week, I would sleep on the floor instead of my luxurious bed. I would walk instead of riding in my litter. I would eat simple bread and water while surrounded by imperial abundance. These weren't acts of self-punishment, were training for my mind, strengthening my ability to find satisfaction independent of external conditions. The real test came during the Germanic campaigns, when I lived in a military tent for months at a time. While other commanders complained about the hardships of campaign life, I found myself oddly content. The voluntary discomfort I had practiced in the palace had prepared me to find peace in circumstances that would have been miserable for someone dependent on luxury. But the discipline of desire goes deeper than just material comfort. I had to learn to want what happened instead of desperately wishing for different outcomes. When trusted advisors betrayed me, instead of burning with resentment, I practiced wanting even that, experiencing it as an opportunity to test my principles and develop my character. This didn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. I still worked tirelessly to achieve the best possible outcomes for the empire, but I learned to hold my plans lightly, to prefer success while accepting setbacks, to hope for the best while finding peace with whatever actually occurred. I remember a particular military campaign where everything went wrong. Our supply lines were cut, our allies deserted us, and disease swept through our ranks. My generals were demoralized, expecting me to rage against our bad fortune. Instead, I gathered them around a map and said, "This is exactly the situation we have. What opportunities does it create that we couldn't see before?" This shift in perspective from resisting reality to embracing it transformed not just my personal peace of mind, but my effectiveness as a leader. When you stop wasting energy fighting against circumstances you can't control, you have more energy to work skillfully with the circumstances you face. The discipline of desire became my daily practice. Each morning I would remind myself, today I will want whatever happens, because wanting what happens is the only reliable path to satisfaction. This didn't mean I stopped working for good outcomes. It meant I stopped making my peace of mind dependent on achieving those outcomes. I applied this principle to interpersonal relationships as well. Instead of wanting people to be different than they were, I practiced wanting them to be exactly as they were, and then working skillfully with their actual nature, rather than fighting against it. A senator who was naturally cautious became someone I could rely on for careful analysis. A general who was naturally aggressive became someone I could count on for bold action. This approach revolutionized my decision-making process. Instead of choosing actions based on what I hoped would happen, I began choosing actions based on what I could accept happening. This led to much wiser choices, because I was factoring in realistic ranges of outcomes rather than just optimistic scenarios. The discipline of desire also freed me from the exhausting cycle of satisfaction and dissatisfaction that enslaves most people. When you get what you want, you're temporarily happy until you want something else. When you don't get what you want, you're frustrated until circumstances change. But when you practice wanting what happens, you step off this emotional roller coaster entirely. I learned to apply this principle even to the most challenging imperial decisions. When I had to choose between competing goods allocating resources to military defense versus infrastructure, balancing the needs of different provinces, weighing short-term costs against long-term benefits, would first want whatever outcome emerged from my careful analysis. This eliminated the emotional distortion that comes from being too attached to particular results. The practice extended to my personal losses as well. When plague took members of my family, when trusted friends died in battle, when age claimed my mentors, I practiced wanting even these painful experiences, not because suffering is good, but because resistance to unavoidable pain only multiplies suffering unnecessarily. This discipline became the secret to maintaining imperial equanimity, regardless of whether news from the provinces was good or bad, whether Senate meetings went smoothly or turned contentious, whether military campaigns succeeded or failed. I could maintain the same steady, thoughtful approach to leadership. The discipline of desire is perhaps the most practical skill any leader can develop. It's the difference between being controlled by circumstances and being responsive to them. Master this discipline, and you'll find that external events lose their power to destabilize your judgment or steal your peace. During the most overwhelming periods of my reign, when crises seemed to pile upon crises, and the weight of imperial responsibility felt unbearable, I discovered a mental technique that transformed my ability to think clearly, the view from above. This practice of gaining cosmic perspective became essential to maintaining imperial judgment. When daily pressures threatened to cloud my reasoning, I first developed this technique during a particularly stressful period when 3 separate provincial rebellions erupted simultaneously while the Senate was deadlocked over tax policy and grain shipments were delayed due to storms in the Mediterranean. Sitting in my study, surrounded by urgent dispatches demanding immediate decisions, I felt my mind becoming scattered and reactive. Each problem seemed catastrophically important. Each decision felt like it could determine the fate of the empire. That's when I remembered my studies of astronomy and mathematics. I walked to the palace roof and looked up at the stars, the same stars that had shone on Julius Caesar, on Alexander, on countless rulers and common people throughout history. In that moment, I gained what I came to call the cosmic perspective, and everything changed. From that elevated viewpoint, both literal and metaphorical, my current troubles appeared in their true proportion. The rebellions that seemed so threatening were tiny disturbances in the vast sweep of imperial history. The Senate deadlock that felt so urgent was a momentary disagreement that would be resolved or forgotten. The delayed grain shipments were a temporary inconvenience in the grand flow of trade and sustenance. I began practicing this perspective shift regularly. When facing any difficult decision or stressful situation, I would mentally zoom out first, seeing myself in my palace, then the palace in Rome, then Rome in Italia, then Italia in the empire, then the empire on the earth, then the earth among the planets, then our world system among the stars. This exercise didn't make my problems disappear, but it restored their proper proportion and cleared my judgment. The view from above taught me that most of what seems urgent actually isn't, and most of what seems permanent is actually temporary. From the cosmic perspective, I could see that the current crisis, however intense, was just one moment in an endless flow of moments. This understanding freed me from the emotional turbulence that comes from treating every challenge as if the universe depends on it. I remember applying this technique during a heated dispute with a provincial governor who was threatening to withdraw his legions if I didn't grant him additional autonomy. In the moment, his demands felt like a direct challenge to imperial authority that could set a dangerous precedent. My initial reaction was anger and the impulse to make an example of him. But then I took the view from above. I saw this governor as one man in one province at one moment in time. I saw his demands not as a threat to eternal order, but as the predictable result of his particular circumstances and personality. I saw our conflict not as a cosmic battle between good and evil, but as a manageable disagreement between two people trying to serve the empire according to their different understandings. This perspective shift completely changed my approach. Instead of responding with imperial wrath, I sent a trusted mediator to understand the governor's actual concerns. It turned out his demands for autonomy were motivated by practical problems with the existing administrative structure, not by personal ambition or disloyalty. We found a solution that addressed his legitimate needs while maintaining imperial unity. The view from above became my refuge during personal losses as well. When members of my family died, when close friends were killed in battle, when age claimed my mentors and advisors, grief threatened to overwhelm my ability to function as emperor. In these moments, the cosmic perspective reminded me that death is the natural order, that every generation passes away to make room for the next. that my personal losses, however painful, were part of the eternal cycle that governs all life. This didn't diminish my love for those I lost or make their deaths less meaningful. Instead, it placed my grief in a context that made it bearable and prevented it from interfering with my duties to the living. From the cosmic view, I could see that honoring the dead meant continuing to serve life, not abandoning my responsibilities to mourn. I taught this technique to my closest advisors and watched it transform their decision-making as well. When they learned to step back from immediate pressures and gain larger perspective, their counsel became more thoughtful and their reactions less volatile. Decisions made from the view from above tend to be wiser because they account for long-term consequences and avoid the distortions that come from being too close to immediate circumstances. The practice also helped me maintain humility despite holding absolute power. From the cosmic perspective, even an emperor is just one person in one place at one time. The view from above reminded me that my reign, however consequential it might feel, was just a brief chapter in the long story of human civilization. This understanding kept me focused on serving something larger than my own legacy or ego. During military campaigns, when battle outcomes felt like matters of ultimate importance, the cosmic view helped me maintain strategic clarity. I could see individual battles as single moves in a larger game, temporary setbacks as opportunities for eventual advancement, apparent victories as merely steps toward longer-term objectives. This perspective prevented both despair after defeats and overconfidence after successes. The technique works just as well for everyday decisions as for imperial crises. When facing any choice that feels overwhelming or any situation that seems catastrophic, mentally zoom out. See your current challenge from the perspective of next week, next year, next decade. Consider how this moment fits into the larger patterns of your life and the broader sweep of human experience. The view from above doesn't solve problems, but it clarifies thinking. It doesn't eliminate challenges, but it puts them in proper proportion. It doesn't make difficult decisions easy, but it helps you approach them with the wisdom that comes from seeing clearly rather than reacting emotionally. Practice this cosmic perspective regularly, especially during calm moments, so it's available when you need it most. The ability to step back and see the bigger picture is one of the most practical skills any leader can develop, and one of the most reliable sources of peace any person can cultivate. Of all the virtues that guide imperial thinking, justice stands supreme, not because it's easier to practice than wisdom, courage, or temperance, but because it's the virtue that connects your personal character to your service of others. Every decision an emperor makes affects countless lives, and justice becomes the measuring stick by which those decisions must be evaluated. I learned this lesson through a case that haunted me for years. A wealthy senator had been accused of embezzling funds meant for veteran pensions money that hundreds of retired soldiers desperately needed to survive. The evidence was strong, but not absolutely conclusive. The senator was politically powerful, with connections throughout the government. Convicting him would create enemies and political instability. Acquitting him would ensure that justice was denied to the veterans he had wronged. I spent sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. My advisors urged caution, pointing out that the senator could be more useful to the empire as an ally than as an enemy. They argued that political stability sometimes required overlooking individual injustices for the greater good. Their reasoning was sophisticated and seemingly practical, but I realized that this decision would define not just this case, but the entire character of my reign. If an emperor could not protect the weak against the powerful, if justice could be sacrificed for political convenience, then what was the point of imperial authority? I was not emperor to make my own life easier, but to ensure that justice flowed throughout the empire, regardless of personal cost. I ordered a thorough investigation, bringing in additional witnesses and documentation. The evidence confirmed the senator's guilt. Despite intense political pressure and threats of retaliation, I convicted him and ordered full restitution to the affected veterans. The political backlash was severe, but something more important was preserved: the principle that justice applies equally to all citizens, regardless of wealth or connections. This experience taught me that justice isn't just about individual cases, it's about the moral fabric that holds civilization together. When justice becomes selective, when power can purchase exemption from consequences, when the weak have no recourse against the strong, society itself begins to dissolve. The emperor's commitment to justice must be absolute, because it's the foundation upon which everything else rests. Justice requires what I called moral mathematics, the ability to weigh competing claims fairly and allocate benefits and burdens according to merit rather than favoritism. This sounds simple in theory, but becomes incredibly complex in practice. How do you balance the needs of different provinces? How do you distribute limited resources among worthy causes? How do you punish wrongdoing without destroying the wrongdoer's potential for redemption? I developed a systematic approach to these questions. First, I would identify all the parties affected by a decision and consider their legitimate interests. Then, I would examine the long-term consequences of different choices, asking which outcome would create the most good for the most people while protecting the rights of minorities. Finally, I would apply the test of universality. If everyone in similar situations acted the same way, would the result benefit or harm society? This framework helped me navigate some of the most difficult decisions of my reign. When famine struck the eastern provinces, I had to choose between sending grain from Rome, risking shortages in the capital, or purchasing expensive grain from Egypt, depleting the treasury needed for military defense. The justice framework led me to send Roman grain while implementing emergency rationing throughout the empire. Everyone shared the burden equally, rather than forcing one region to bear it all. Justice also required me to confront my own biases and preferences. I naturally favored advisors who agreed with me, provinces that caused fewer problems, policies that made my job easier. But imperial justice demanded that I give fair consideration to dissenting voices, allocate resources based on need rather than convenience, and support policies that served the empire even when they made my personal life more difficult. The hardest aspect of practicing justice was learning to separate personal feelings from fair judgment. When people I liked made mistakes, I wanted to excuse them. When people I disliked were treated unfairly, I was tempted to look the other way. But justice requires the emperor to act as an impartial arbiter, setting aside personal relationships in favor of objective evaluation. I remember a case where my own adopted son was accused of abusing his authority as a provincial commander. Every parental instinct urged me to protect him, to find excuses for his behavior, to use my imperial power to shield him from consequences. But I realized that if the emperor's family could escape justice, then justice itself would become meaningless for everyone else. I ordered a full investigation, and when his guilt was confirmed, imposed the same punishment any other commander would have faced. It was one of the most painful decisions of my reign, but it was necessary to preserve the principle that justice applies universally. My son eventually thanked me for this decision, saying it forced him to develop genuine character rather than relying on imperial privilege. Justice extends beyond legal decisions to every aspect of leadership. It means giving credit where credit is due, accepting responsibility for failures, listening to criticism with an open mind, and treating all people with the dignity their humanity deserves. Justice is the virtue that transforms power from a tool of personal advantage into an instrument of universal service. I learnt that justice often requires mercy, but mercy uninformed by justice becomes mere sentiment. True mercy considers the long-term effects of lenience, asking whether showing compassion, in this case, will encourage virtue or enable vice. Sometimes the most merciful action is firm consequences that prevent future wrongdoing. The practice of justice also shaped my approach to lawmaking. I insisted that new laws be clear, consistent, and capable of being fairly applied across diverse circumstances. Laws that could only be interpreted correctly by experts, or that created different standards for different classes of people, violated the imperial commitment to justice. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that justice must begin with before I could fairly evaluate others' actions, I had to honestly assess my own motives, mistakes, and moral failures. The emperor who cannot acknowledge his own shortcomings lacks the moral authority to correct others. Wrongs. Justice became the lens through which I viewed every imperial decision, not what would benefit me, or what would be popular, but what would be fair. This standard often led to difficult choices and unpopular decisions, but it created a reign that I could defend to my own conscience and to history. Remember, justice isn't about perfection. It's about the sincere effort to treat all people fairly according to consistent principles. When you make justice your highest priority, you transform whatever authority you have from a tool of self-interest into an instrument of service. This is the essence of thinking like an emperor, using your power to create fairness in an unfair world. True courage in leadership isn't about charging into battle or making dramatic gestures. It's about making the right decision when everyone around you wants you to make the easy one. I learned this distinction during one of the most challenging periods of my reign, when I had to choose between popular approval and what I knew was necessary for the empire's long-term survival. The crisis emerged during my 8th year as emperor, when a series of poor harvests coincided with increased military expenses along the frontier. The treasury was strained, and I faced a choice that would define my legacy. I could maintain popular programs that kept citizens happy but would bankrupt the empire within a decade, or I could implement necessary but unpopular economic reforms that would ensure long-term stability. My advisors were unanimous in counseling delay. Wait until the harvests improve, they said. Wait until the military situation stabilizes. Wait until public opinion shifts. But I realized that this advice, however well-intentioned, was based on fear rather than wisdom. They feared the immediate political consequences of difficult decisions more than they feared the eventual collapse that would result from avoiding those decisions. That night, alone in my study, I confronted the difference between physical courage and moral courage. Physical courage is responding to immediate, visible threats, the enemy soldier charging with a sword, the building collapsing in an earthquake. Moral courage is responding to long-term, abstract threats, the gradual erosion of institutions, the slow decline of standards, the eventual consequences of today's compromises. I made the decision to implement the reforms immediately, knowing it would make me deeply unpopular with large segments of the population. I increased taxes on luxury goods, reduced subsidies for public entertainment, and imposed stricter fiscal controls on provincial spending. The backlash was immediate and severe. Senators who had previously supported me began plotting against my policies. Citizens who had celebrated my victories now grumbled about my austerity measures. This experience taught me that courage in leadership often means being willing to be misunderstood. The emperor who needs everyone to approve of his decisions will make decisions based on what's popular rather than what's necessary. True imperial thinking requires the strength to accept temporary unpopularity in service of long-term benefit. I discovered that moral courage requires specific practices to maintain. First, I had to develop independence from external validation. This didn't mean ignoring advice or becoming arrogant, but it meant basing decisions on principle rather than on the desire to be liked. I learned to find satisfaction in knowing I had done what was right, regardless of whether others recognized or appreciated it. Second, I had to cultivate what I called future thinking, the ability to care more about long-term consequences than short-term comfort. This required daily practice in considering how today's decisions would affect people who weren't yet born, provinces that weren't yet developed, challenges that weren't yet visible. Courage in leadership means accepting responsibility for outcomes you may never live to see. The third element was learning to distinguish between reasonable criticism and mere resistance to necessary change. When people opposed my reforms, I had to determine whether their objections pointed to real flaws in my policies or simply reflected their discomfort with being asked to sacrifice for the common good. This discernment became crucial to maintaining both courage and wisdom in leadership decisions. I remember a particular Senate session where opposition to my economic policies reached a fever pitch. Several senators delivered passionate speeches about the hardships my reforms were creating for their constituents. The pressure to reverse course was enormous, but as I listened, I realized that none of their objections addressed the fundamental problem. The empire's expenses exceeded its revenues, and this imbalance would eventually destroy everything we were trying to preserve. I stood before the Senate and delivered what became known as the Emperor's Choice speech. I explained that I could choose to be popular today and remembered as the emperor who bankrupted Rome, or I could choose to be unpopular today and remembered as the emperor who saved the empire for future generations. I told them that history would judge us not by how comfortable we made our own lives, but by what kind of world we left for our children and grandchildren. This speech marked a turning point, not because it immediately converted my opponents, but because it clarified the moral stakes of our choices. Some senators began to support the reforms. Others continued their opposition, but with less intensity. Most importantly, I had demonstrated that imperial courage means choosing difficult right actions over easy wrong ones. Courage in leadership also requires the strength to admit mistakes and change course when evidence warrants it. One of my early military decisions had led to unnecessary casualties because I misread the strategic situation. My first instinct was to defend the decision to protect my reputation as a commander, but I realized that true courage meant acknowledging the error, learning from it, and implementing changes to prevent similar mistakes in the future. I called together my senior officers and publicly took responsibility for the flawed strategy. I explained what I had misunderstood and how I would approach similar situations differently in the future. This admission of fallibility initially surprised some of my commanders, but it ultimately strengthened their confidence in my leadership, because they saw that I cared more about getting things right than about appearing infallible. The courage to be vulnerable as a leader, to acknowledge uncertainty, to admit mistakes, to ask for help when needed, became one of my most valuable tools. It created an environment where advisors felt safe to disagree with me, where subordinates could point out potential problems, where innovation flourished because people weren't afraid of being blamed for failures. I learned that courage compounds. Over time, each brave decision makes the next one slightly easier. Each time you choose principle over popularity, you build the moral strength needed for even greater challenges. Conversely, each time you compromise necessary action for immediate comfort, you make future courage more difficult to summon. The economic reforms I implemented with such difficulty eventually proved successful. The empire's finances stabilized, enabling us to invest in infrastructure, defense, and institutions that served Rome for generations. But the real victory wasn't in the policies themselves. It was in establishing the principle that imperial leadership sometimes requires the courage to be temporarily wrong in the eyes of the world in order to be ultimately right in the judgment of history. Courage in leadership isn't about being fearless. It's about acting rightly despite fear. The emperor who feels no anxiety about difficult decisions probably isn't fully grasping their complexity or consequences. True courage acknowledges the risks while choosing to act according to principle rather than comfort, according to long-term necessity rather than short-term popularity. The greatest teacher I ever had was failure itself, not the philosophers who tutored me in my youth, not the experienced advisors who guided my early reign, but the harsh instructor of setbacks, mistakes, and disasters that seemed to multiply whenever I thought I had mastered the art of imperial leadership. I learned that thinking like an emperor means transforming every obstacle into education and every defeat into wisdom. My most profound lesson came during what I still consider my greatest failure as emperor, the rebellion of Avidius. Cassius, this trusted general, who had served me loyally for years in the eastern provinces, declared himself emperor based on false reports of my death. When the news reached me, I felt a betrayal so deep it threatened to shatter my faith in human nature and my confidence in my own judgment. My first reaction was rage. How could someone I had trusted, promoted, and considered almost a son turn against me so completely? My advisors urged immediate military action to crush the rebellion before it could spread. The Senate called for Cassius to be declared an enemy of the state. Everything in me wanted to march east with overwhelming force and make an example that would deter future betrayals. But that night, alone with my thoughts, I forced myself to examine this disaster as a teacher rather than simply an enemy to be defeated. What had this rebellion revealed about my leadership? What mistakes in judgment, communication, or policy had created the conditions for this betrayal? How could I transform this crisis into an opportunity for growth rather than just revenge? I realized that Cassius's rebellion exposed several serious flaws in my imperial system. I had been so focused on the Germanic frontier that I had neglected communication with the eastern provinces. I had trusted individual loyalty without building institutional safeguards. I had failed to anticipate how rumors of my death might destabilize distant regions. The rebellion was partly a result of my own oversight and complacency. This recognition completely changed my response. Instead of immediately marching east with an army, I sent trusted messengers to prove I was alive and to offer amnesty to anyone who had joined the rebellion under false pretenses. I used the crisis as an opportunity to strengthen communication systems throughout the empire. Most importantly, I chose to see Cassius himself not as an irredeemable traitor, but as someone who had made a terrible mistake based on incomplete information. When Cassius was killed by his own soldiers before I could reach him, I felt sadness rather than satisfaction. The opportunity to demonstrate imperial mercy had been lost, but the lessons of the rebellion remained. I implemented reforms that prevented similar communication failures, established clearer succession protocols, and created redundant systems for verifying critical information across vast distances. This experience taught me the Stoic principle that obstacles are not impediments to the path, they are the path. Every setback contains information about how to proceed more wisely. Every failure reveals assumptions that need to be questioned, systems that need to be strengthened, skills that need to be developed. The emperor who tries to avoid adversity learns nothing. The emperor who embraces adversity as education becomes truly wise began to actively seek out the lessons in every difficult situation. When natural disasters struck the empire, I asked not just how do we respond, but what does this teach us about our preparedness and resilience? When diplomatic negotiations failed, I examined not just the other party's unreasonableness, but my own communication, mistakes, and unrealistic expectations. During a particularly challenging period when 3 separate crises emerged simultaneously in Egypt, barbarian raids in Britain, and a political scandal in Gaul, my advisors expected me to be overwhelmed. Instead, I saw it as an advanced course in imperial management. Each crisis taught me something different. The flooding revealed gaps in our disaster response systems. The raids exposed weaknesses in our defensive strategies. And the scandal showed the need for better oversight of provincial officials. I learned to distinguish between different types of adversity and their different lessons. Personal setbacks like the deaths of family members or the betrayal of friends taught me about acceptance, resilience, and the importance of finding meaning beyond immediate circumstances. Political setbacks like policy failures or resistance from the Senate taught me about human nature, institutional dynamics, and the art of persuasion. Military setbacks like battlefield defeats or strategic miscalculations taught me about planning, logistics, and the unpredictability of complex operations. The key insight was that adversity teaches lessons that success cannot. When things go well, you might be succeeding because of good strategy or just good luck. When things go badly, you're forced to examine your assumptions, strengthen your weaknesses, and develop new capabilities. Success can make you overconfident. Failure makes you wise. I developed what I called failure analysis, a systematic process for extracting maximum learning from every setback. First, I would examine the objective facts of what went wrong without defensiveness or blame. Then, I would identify which factors were within my control and which were not. Next, I would determine what specific actions or decisions contributed to the negative outcome. Finally, I would design concrete changes to prevent similar failures. In the future, this process transformed my relationship with mistakes and setbacks. Instead of sources of shame or frustration, they became valuable data for improvement. I started to worry more about leaders who never failed than about those who failed and learned. Failure that leads to wisdom is more valuable than success that leads to complacency. I also learned that adversity tests the authenticity of your principles. It's easy to practice virtue when circumstances are favorable, when people support you, when your plans work out. The real test comes when you're facing opposition, when resources are scarce, when everything seems to be going wrong. Those moments reveal whether your philosophical commitments are genuine convictions or merely convenient theories. During the plague years, when my Stoic principles were tested by massive death and suffering, I discovered which aspects of my philosophy were truly part of me and which were just intellectual concepts I had adopted. The ideas that sustained me through that crisis became the foundation of my mature understanding of imperial leadership. I began to see that the emperor's greatest responsibility is not to avoid all mistakes. That's impossible, but to learn from mistakes so thoroughly that they become investments in future wisdom. Each failure that teaches you something valuable is a failure that serves the empire, even if it causes temporary setbacks. This perspective also changed how I evaluated my subordinates. I stopped promoting people who had never failed and started promoting people who had failed, learned, and grown stronger. The general who had never lost a battle might be lucky or cautious. The general who had lost battles but learned to win wars was truly valuable. Near the end of my reign, I could look back on my failures with something approaching gratitude. The rebellion that seemed so devastating had led to reforms that strengthened the empire. The military defeats that felt so humiliating had taught me strategies that prevented larger disasters. The personal betrayals that caused such pain had developed my capacity for wisdom and forgiveness. Adversity is not the opposite of imperial success. It's the raw material from which imperial wisdom is forged. The emperor who learns to welcome obstacles as teachers, to embrace setbacks as education, and to transform failures into stepping stones, has mastered one of the most essential aspects of leadership thinking. Every challenge becomes an opportunity, every problem becomes a teacher, and every defeat becomes the foundation for future victory. The most dangerous trap awaiting any emperor is the intoxication of unlimited power. When you can command anything, have anything, do anything, the greatest challenge becomes choosing to want less rather than more. I learned that true imperial strength lies not in taking everything you can, but in taking only what you should. This lesson crystallized for me during a seemingly minor incident in my 10th year as emperor. I was reviewing proposals for a new imperial palace. Architects had designed something magnificent that would have dwarfed every previous imperial residence. The plans showed hundreds of rooms, elaborate gardens, fountains that would require redirecting entire rivers, artwork that would cost more than feeding a province for a year. As I studied these drawings, I felt the seductive pull of limitless luxury. I could build this palace. I could command the finest artisans in the empire. I could create a monument to imperial power that would awe visitors for centuries. The architects waited eagerly for my approval, already envisioning their masterpiece rising from the Roman hills. But that night, I walked through my existing quarters rooms that were already far more luxurious than anything available to ordinary citizens. I asked myself a simple question: what would building this palace serve besides my own vanity? The honest answer was uncomfortable. The new palace would serve no function except to demonstrate that I could build it. It would drain resources that could feed the hungry, defend the borders, or build infrastructure that actually improved people's lives. I rejected the palace proposal and ordered the architects to design public buildings, instead libraries, aqueducts, hospitals. The decision surprised many at court, who had expected me to embrace the grandest expression of imperial power. But I had learned that true power lies in restraint, not in indulgence. This experience taught me the principle of imperial temperance, the discipline of using power moderately rather than maximally. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Just because you have access to pleasures doesn't mean you should pursue them. Just because you command vast resources doesn't mean you should consume them. I began to practice voluntary limitation in every area of imperial life. When offered exotic foods from across the empire, I chose simple meals that any citizen could afford. When presented with entertainment options that could last from dawn to dusk, I limited myself to brief diversions that refreshed rather than exhausted me. When surrounded by advisors eager to flatter and agree, I sought out counselors who would challenge my thinking. The hardest aspect of practicing temperance was learning to resist the constant temptation to solve problems through the brute force of imperial authority. When provincial governors requested additional legions to handle local disturbances, my first impulse was often to grant their requests. After all, I had plenty of soldiers. But I learned to ask whether military force was truly necessary, or whether patience, negotiation, or structural reforms might achieve better long-term results. I remember a situation where merchants in several cities were engaging in price manipulation during a grain shortage. The obvious imperial solution was to threaten severe punishment, imprisonment, exile, even execution. But I realized that using extreme punishment for economic crimes might solve the immediate problem while creating larger issues of fear and resentment instead. I chose the more moderate approach of adjusting trade regulations and creating incentives for fair pricing. The solution took longer to implement and required more careful planning, but it addressed the root causes of the problem rather than just its symptoms. This taught me that temperance often means choosing the more difficult path that serves long-term stability over the easier path that provides immediate satisfaction. Temperance in power also meant learning to delegate authority rather than hoarding it. My natural inclination was to personally review every important decision, to maintain direct control over every significant imperial function. But I realized that this approach, while psychologically satisfying, was both inefficient and unwise. I began systematically transferring decision-making authority to capable subordinates. establishing clear guidelines and accountability systems, but allowing them substantial autonomy within those boundaries. This was difficult for me personally. It required trusting others with matters I cared deeply about and accepting that their solutions might be different from mine. But the results were remarkable. Not only did this approach make the imperial government more efficient, it also developed a generation of capable leaders who could think independently while serving imperial objectives. I learned that the emperor who tries to control everything actually controls very little, while the emperor who controls himself can guide vast enterprises through the wisdom of others. Perhaps the most challenging application of temperance was in my personal relationships. As emperor, I could surround myself only with people who agreed with me, who entertained me, who made me feel important and wise. The temptation to curate my social environment for maximum comfort was enormous. Instead, I made the conscious choice to maintain relationships with people who challenged me, disagreed with me, and sometimes made me uncomfortable. I kept advisors who questioned my policies, friends who criticized my decisions, and family members who treated me as Marcus rather than as emperor. These relationships required more emotional energy and often created stress, but they kept me connected to reality and prevented the isolation that corrupts many leaders. I also practiced temperance in my reaction to criticism and praise. When senators praised my policies, I felt the natural human pleasure of approval. But I trained myself to focus on whether the policies actually served the empire, rather than on how they enhanced my reputation. When critics attacked my decisions, I felt the natural sting of disapproval, but I learned to extract useful information from their objections rather than simply defending my ego. This emotional temperance proved essential during the most challenging periods of my reign. When the plague devastated the empire and people blamed imperial policies for their suffering, I could have become defensive or despairing. Instead, I maintained focus on what needed to be done rather than on how I felt about the situation or how others perceived my leadership. Temperance extended to my intellectual life as well. As someone who loved learning and philosophical discussion, I could have spent all my time in scholarly pursuits while neglecting the practical demands of governance. The discipline required to balance intellectual interests with administrative duties taught me that even good activities can become excessive if they crowd out other responsibilities. I learned to set boundaries around my study time, my writing, my philosophical discussions. These activities enriched my thinking and provided necessary mental refreshment, but they could not be allowed to dominate my schedule at the expense of the empire's needs. This balance between personal fulfillment and public duty became a model for how I approached every aspect of imperial life. The practice of temperance ultimately taught me that less can be more powerful than more. The emperor who eats simply appreciates food more than the emperor who feasts constantly. The emperor who chooses his words carefully has more influence than the emperor who speaks constantly. The emperor who exercises power judiciously commands more respect than the emperor who uses force reflexively. Temperance in power isn't about self-denial for its own sake, it's about using restraint as a tool for greater effectiveness. When you choose moderation over excess, focus over dispersal, quality over quantity, you concentrate your resources and attention where they can have the greatest positive impact. The disciplined use of power multiplies power. The undisciplined use of power squanders it in the swirling chaos of imperial responsibility, where the weight of past decisions and the anxiety of future consequences constantly demand attention. I discovered that the only place where actual power exists is in the present moment. This realization transformed not just my effectiveness as emperor, but my ability to find peace within the storm of constant demands and decisions. The lesson came during a particularly overwhelming day, when I was simultaneously managing a diplomatic crisis with Parthia, reviewing reports of flooding in the Nile Delta, and preparing for a crucial Senate vote on military funding. My mind was fragmenting, part of it replaying yesterday's failed negotiation, part of it worrying about next month's potential military campaign, and only a small fraction actually focused on the immediate task at hand. As I sat in my study that evening, surrounded by scrolls requiring urgent attention, I realized I was accomplishing nothing effectively because I was trying to mentally exist in 3 different time periods simultaneously. The past was consuming energy with regret and analysis. The future was stealing focus with anxiety and planning. The present, the only time when I could actually make decisions and take action, was receiving the scattered remnants of my attention. That night, I developed what became my most practical philosophical tool, the discipline of present moment awareness. I began training my mind to recognize when it was drifting into past or future concerns and gently but firmly returning attention to whatever I was actually doing right now. This practice started with simple exercises. When reading reports from provincial governors, I would notice when my mind began anticipating problems that might arise next year, and I would redirect focus to understanding the current situation being described. When meeting with advisors, I would catch myself mentally rehearsing what I wanted to say next, instead of truly listening to what they were saying now, and I would return my attention to their actual words. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. When I gave full attention to present tasks, I completed them more efficiently and with better quality. When I listened to advisors with complete presence, I understood their recommendations more clearly and could respond more thoughtfully. When I focused entirely on current decisions, I made choices based on actual circumstances rather than on fears of imaginary future scenarios. I began to understand that the present moment is where all imperial power actually resides. You cannot change yesterday's decisions. You can only learn from them and apply that learning to today's choices. You cannot control tomorrow's outcomes. You can only take wise action today that increases the probability of favorable results. The emperor who mentally lives in past regrets or future anxieties has abandoned the only time when he actually has authority and influence. This insight proved crucial during military campaigns, where the ability to respond to rapidly changing circumstances often determines victory or defeat. I learned to make tactical decisions based on current battlefield conditions rather than on what I had planned before the battle or what I hoped would happen later. When intelligence reports contradicted my expectations, I could adjust strategy immediately instead of clinging to outdated assumptions. I remember a particular engagement where our initial battle plan became completely obsolete within the first hour due to unexpected enemy movements. Officers were looking to me for guidance, but many of my commanders were still mentally fighting the battle they had expected rather than the battle that was actually occurring. By focusing entirely on present conditions where our forces were positioned now, what the enemy was doing now, what opportunities existed now, I could issue orders that turned potential disaster into decisive victory. The discipline of present moment focus also revolutionized my approach to problem solving. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by the magnitude of imperial challenges, I learned to break every large problem into a series of present moment actions. Feeding a province during famine became, right now, assess available grain stores. Right now, contact suppliers. Right now, organize transportation. Right now, coordinate distribution. Each step was manageable because it existed only in the present. This approach proved especially valuable during the plague years, when the scale of death and suffering could easily paralyze decision-making. I couldn't solve the entire crisis at once, but I could take specific actions each day to reduce suffering and maintain essential functions. Present moment focus became a refuge from despair and a source of sustained effectiveness during the darkest period of my reign. I also discovered that present moment awareness enhanced my relationships with others. When meeting with senators, instead of mentally preparing my responses while they spoke, I learned to listen with complete attention. This deeper listening revealed nuances in their concerns that I had previously missed, allowing me to address their real issues rather than the issues I assumed they had. The practice extended to my family life as well. During the brief time I could spend with my children, instead of mentally reviewing state business or planning the next day's activities, I gave them my complete presence. These moments of full attention created deeper connections than hours of distracted time together. Perhaps most importantly, present moment focus became my refuge from the weight of imperial responsibility. When the burden of ruling 60 million people felt overwhelming, I could return to this simple truth. Right now, I only need to handle what is actually before me, not the accumulated weight of all past decisions, not the crushing anticipation of all future challenges, but simply the specific task or decision that exists in this moment. I developed practical techniques to cultivate this awareness throughout my daily routine. When walking through the palace, I would pay attention to the sensation of my feet touching the floor, rather than letting my mind race ahead to the destination. When eating meals, I would focus on the taste and texture of food rather than using mealtime for mental planning. When reviewing documents, I would read each line with full attention rather than rushing toward the conclusion. These simple practices strengthened my ability to remain present during high-stakes situations. The mind that wanders during routine activities will wander during crucial moments as well. The mind trained to focus completely on simple tasks can maintain that focus when dealing with complex imperial challenges. I learned that present moment awareness is not about ignoring the lessons of the past or abandoning plans for the future. It's about recognizing that the past and future are most useful when considered from a foundation of present clarity. When you're fully grounded in current reality, you can learn from history without being trapped by it, and you can plan for the future without being anxious about it. The emperor who masters the present moment has access to all his resources, full intelligence, complete attention, undivided energy. The emperor, whose mind is scattered across past and future, operates at a fraction of his potential. In a role where decisions affect millions of lives, this difference in effectiveness can determine the fate of civilizations. This is perhaps the most practical wisdom I can share. Whatever challenges you face, however overwhelming your responsibilities may seem, remember that your actual power exists only in this moment. Yesterday's mistakes cannot be undone, but today's response to them can be wise. Tomorrow's problems cannot be solved until they arrive, but today's preparation can make them manageable. The present moment is where emperors are made. Of all the teachers that shaped my imperial thinking, none was more powerful or more practical than the contemplation of death. This may seem morbid, but I learned that regular meditation on mortality clarifies priorities, intensifies focus, and transforms every decision from a casual choice into a meaningful contribution to whatever legacy you will leave behind. The practice began during my early years as emperor, when I started each morning by reminding myself that this day might be my last, not from pessimism or fear, but from a desire to approach each decision with appropriate seriousness. If I had only one day left to influence the empire, what would truly matter? Which meetings would be essential and which merely habitual? What words would I want my final communications to be? This daily confrontation with mortality immediately changed how I spent my time. Trivial concerns that had previously consumed hours of attention suddenly seemed unworthy of an emperor's limited moments. Petty disputes that had once triggered emotional reactions became obviously insignificant compared to the great work of serving civilization. The knowledge that my time was finite made every hour precious and focused my attention on activities that would matter beyond my lifetime. I remember the specific morning when this practice proved its value. A courier had arrived with news of my son Commodus's latest troubling behavior incidents that, while not yet serious enough to require intervention, suggested disturbing patterns in his character development. My first reaction was the familiar parental anxiety that had been growing for months as I watched him struggle with the responsibilities of imperial succession. But then, I applied my mortality meditation. If I were to die tonight, what would I want my final communication to my son to be? Not criticism or disappointment, but wisdom that might guide him toward becoming the leader the empire would need. This perspective shifted my entire approach from reactive worry to proactive teaching. Instead of dwelling on his current failures, I focused on what lessons I could share that might prevent future ones. The contemplation of death became my most reliable tool for distinguishing between important and urgent matters. Urgent tasks demand immediate attention, but may have little lasting significance. Important tasks contribute to outcomes that matter beyond the current crisis. When viewed from the perspective of someone whose days are numbered, this distinction becomes crystal clear. I began asking myself a simple question about every major decision. How will this matter when I'm gone? Policies that would enhance my personal reputation but provide little lasting benefit to the empire lost their appeal. Reforms that might be politically difficult but would strengthen institutions for future generations gained priority. The knowledge that I was mortal made me think like a builder rather than just a manager. Death meditation also transformed my relationship with failure and criticism. When you regularly contemplate the fact that your reign will end and your body will decay, the sting of temporary setbacks loses much of its power. I could face military defeats, political opposition, or personal betrayals with greater equanimity because I understood that these problems were temporary while the principles I was defending were eternal. During the devastating plague that bore my name, when death surrounded me daily and I lost numerous family members and close friends, this philosophical preparation proved invaluable. Instead of being paralyzed by grief or overwhelmed by the magnitude of loss, I could channel my sadness into determination to honor the dead by serving the living more effectively. I developed specific practices to deepen this meditation. Each evening, I would review the day's activities and ask whether I would be satisfied with them if they were my final acts as emperor. Each morning, I would imagine receiving news that I had only weeks to live and consider what preparations I would want to make. These exercises weren't morbid fantasies, but practical tools for maintaining perspective and priorities. The practice led to what I called legacy thinking, evaluating every decision based on its contribution to the kind of empire I wanted to leave behind. This didn't mean trying to control outcomes beyond my death, which would be impossible, but rather ensuring that my choices, while alive, created the strongest possible foundation for whatever would follow. Legacy thinking influenced my approach to personnel decisions, particularly. Instead of appointing advisors who made my current job easier, I chose people who would strengthen the imperial system regardless of who succeeded me. Instead of promoting generals who were personally loyal to me, I advanced officers who were loyal to Roman principles. I was building for an empire that would outlast Marcus Aurelius, not an empire that depended on Marcus Aurelius. Death meditation also shaped my daily interactions with others. Knowing that any conversation might be our last made me more patient with difficult people, more generous with praise for good work, more direct about important concerns. I stopped postponing difficult conversations that needed to happen and started having more meaningful exchanges with people who mattered to me. I remember a particular evening when I learned that an old friend and trusted advisor was dying of the plague. My first impulse was to send a formal message of condolence and continue with my scheduled activities. But my mortality practice made me pause and ask, If this were my final communication with someone who had served the empire faithfully for decades, what would I want it to be? I immediately left my official duties and spent the evening at his bedside, sharing memories of our campaigns together and expressing gratitude for his years of service. He died that night, and I realized that, had I followed my initial impulse, I would have regretted that missed opportunity for the rest of my life. Death meditation had given me the wisdom to recognize what truly mattered in that moment. The practice also influenced my approach to imperial ceremonies and traditions. Many court rituals served no practical purpose beyond displaying imperial majesty, consuming valuable time that could be used for actual governance. When viewed from the perspective of limited mortality, these elaborate displays seemed wasteful unless they specifically served the empire's long-term interests. I simplified many court procedures and eliminated ceremonies that existed purely for show, redirecting that time and those resources toward activities that would strengthen Roman civilization. This wasn't about rejecting tradition, but about honoring it by focusing on traditions that actually served Rome's future rather than just indulging Rome's vanity. Perhaps most importantly, death meditation taught me to embrace what the Stoics called the preferred indifference, things that are naturally preferable, but not essential to a meaningful life. Health is preferable to sickness, success to failure, praise to criticism, but none of these outcomes determines the worth of your existence. When you regularly contemplate mortality, you realize that the only thing that truly matters is whether you used your time well while you had it. This understanding freed me from the anxiety that plagues many leaders, the desperate need to control outcomes, to ensure success, to avoid all criticism. I could work with maximum effort while holding results lightly, knowing that my duty was to make wise decisions with available information rather than to guarantee particular results through sheer willpower. Near the end of my reign, as I felt my own strength declining and knew that my time as emperor was drawing to a close, this lifelong practice of death meditation provided the peace I needed to transition gracefully from active leadership to whatever comes after. I could review my years of service with satisfaction, not because they were perfect, but because they were lived with full awareness of their temporary nature and dedicated to purposes that would outlast my personal existence. Remember, you are mortal, and this knowledge is a gift rather than a burden. Let it clarify your priorities, intensify your focus, and inspire you to use whatever time and authority you have in service of something greater than your immediate comfort or ego. Think like an emperor who knows his reign will end, and you'll make choices worthy of an eternal legacy. The loneliness of absolute power is not a poetic metaphor. It is a practical reality that every emperor must confront and overcome. When your decisions affect millions of lives, and your personal relationships can become matters of state, maintaining authentic human connections requires conscious effort and philosophical discipline. I learned that thinking like an emperor means developing the capacity to love people while making difficult decisions about them. This challenge first became clear to me through my relationship with my adoptive brother Lucius Verus, who served as my co-emperor during the early years of my reign. We had grown up together, shared the same philosophical education, and genuinely cared for each other as family. But when he began making military decisions in the East that I believed were strategically unwise and morally questionable, I faced an agonizing choice between personal loyalty and imperial responsibility. The easy path would have been to overlook his mistakes to preserve our relationship, or to publicly condemn him to preserve my authority. Neither option served the empire well. Instead, I had to develop what I called principled love, the ability to care deeply for someone while holding them accountable to the same standards. I applied to all imperial servants. I sent private messages to Lucius expressing my concerns, clearly but respectfully, offering guidance rather than criticism. When he continued making questionable decisions, I gradually transferred authority to other commanders while allowing him to maintain his dignity. When he died unexpectedly during the campaign, I grieved genuinely for the brother I had lost while recognizing that his death had solved a problem I hadn't known how to resolve. This experience taught me that imperial relationships require a delicate balance between emotional connection and objective judgment. You cannot stop loving people because they disappoint you professionally, but you cannot let personal feelings override your responsibility to the greater good. The emperor's heart and the emperor's mind must work together, not against each other. The most challenging test of this principle came through my relationship with my son Commodus. As his father, I wanted to see the best in him, to believe that his troubling behaviors were temporary phases that would pass with maturity. As emperor, I had to acknowledge that his character defects might make him unfit to rule the empire. The tension between these perspectives created years of internal struggle. I tried everything I could think of to guide Commodus toward becoming the leader Rome would need. I arranged for him to study with the finest philosophers, to serve with experienced military commanders, to observe imperial decision-making firsthand. I modeled the behaviors I hoped he would adopt and patiently explained the reasoning behind difficult choices. But I could not force his character to develop in directions it was not naturally inclined to go. The hardest moment came when I had to decide whether to name Commodus as my successor despite my concerns about his fitness to rule. Every instinct, as a father, wanted to give my son the inheritance he expected. Every instinct as emperor warned that his reign might damage the empire I had spent my life serving. The decision kept me awake for months as I struggled between love and duty. I ultimately chose to prepare Commodus as thoroughly as possible, while hoping that the responsibilities of imperial office might inspire him to rise to the occasion. This decision haunted me because I knew it might be wrong, but I could not bring myself to pass over my only surviving son in favor of adoption or designation of a non-family member. Sometimes the emperor must make imperfect choices between competing loyalties and live with the consequences. Through experiences like these, I learned that imperial thinking requires what I called compartmentalized affection. You must be able to love people in their personal capacity while evaluating them objectively in their professional roles. Your feelings for them as individuals cannot distort your assessment of their capabilities or performance in positions of responsibility. This principle applied to friendships as well as family relationships. I maintained close friendships with several senators and military commanders, but I could not allow these personal connections to influence my evaluation of their policy recommendations or strategic proposals. When friends gave me bad advice, I had to be able to reject their counsel without rejecting them personally. I developed specific practices to maintain this balance. In my private interactions with family and friends, I tried to set aside my imperial role and relate to them simply as Marcus. In my official interactions with these same people, I tried to set aside my personal feelings and evaluate them simply as servants of the empire. This mental discipline required constant attention but prevented the corruption of judgment that destroys many leaders. The practice also required absolute honesty about my own motivations and biases. When I favored someone's recommendation, I had to ask whether it was because the recommendation was wise or because I liked the person making it. When I resisted someone's advice, I had to determine whether it was because the advice was flawed or because I disliked the advisor. This self-examination became a daily necessity. Imperial relationships also taught me about the burden that leadership places on the people closest to you. My family members could never completely escape the fact that they were related to the emperor. My friends could never entirely forget that their personal relationships might have political implications. Every conversation carried the weight of my position, even when I tried to set it aside. I learned to be sensitive to this burden and to create spaces where people could relate to me as naturally as possible, despite the inevitable constraints. I established times and places where imperial business was explicitly off limits, where people could express disagreement or criticism without fear of political consequences. These sanctuaries of normal human interaction became essential for maintaining authentic relationships. The loneliness of leadership also taught me to value advisors and friends who would tell me difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. I actively sought out people who cared more about my success as emperor than about my personal happiness, who would challenge my thinking even when it created tension between us. These relationships were sometimes uncomfortable but always valuable. I remember one advisor who consistently opposed my philosophical approach to governance, arguing that I was too idealistic and not pragmatic enough. Our debates were intense and sometimes heated, but I came to treasure his perspective because it forced me to defend and refine my principles. When he died, I felt the loss deeply, not just personally, but professionally, because I had lost someone whose disagreement made me stronger. Perhaps the most important lesson about imperial relationships was learning to distinguish between people who wanted to use my position for their own benefit and people who genuinely wanted to help me serve the empire effectively. This distinction required careful observation of how people behaved when they thought I wasn't watching, how they treated others who couldn't help them advance, how they responded when their advice was rejected. I developed what I called relationship maintenance, regular practices to preserve authentic connections despite the distorting effects of power. I made time for purely personal conversations with family members, for informal meals with trusted friends, for philosophical discussions that had no political agenda. These investments in relationship required deliberate scheduling because the demands of imperial office would otherwise consume all available time. I also learned the importance of expressing gratitude explicitly and regularly. People who serve emperors often sacrifice their own interests for the empire's benefit, and this service can become invisible if you don't consciously acknowledge it. I made it a practice to thank people not just for extraordinary service, but for ordinary faithfulness, not just for public achievements, but for private loyalty. The emperor who fails to maintain authentic relationships becomes isolated from the very reality he is trying to govern. You need people who will tell you when your policies aren't working, when your behavior is creating problems, when your assumptions about situations are incorrect. But these people will only speak honestly if they trust that you value their relationship more than you value comfortable agreement. I discovered that some of my most valuable relationships were with people who had no political ambitions and wanted nothing from me except honest friendship. Palace servants, provincial craftsmen, retired soldiers, people whose lives gave them perspectives I couldn't get from senators or generals. These relationships reminded me of the human cost of imperial decisions and kept me connected to the experiences of ordinary citizens. Near the end of my reign, as I reflected on the relationships that had sustained me through decades of imperial responsibility, I realized that the capacity to love and be loved is not a luxury for leaders, it's a necessity. The emperor who becomes too guarded, too suspicious, too isolated may protect himself from betrayal, but also cuts himself off from the human connections that make leadership meaningful and provide the emotional resources necessary for sustained service. The challenge is maintaining these connections without compromising your judgment or allowing personal feelings to distort professional decisions. This balance requires constant attention and philosophical discipline, but it's essential for any leader who wants to remain both effective and human. You must learn to love people while leading them, to care for them while making difficult decisions about them, to maintain relationships while upholding principles. Remember, imperial thinking doesn't require you to become emotionally detached from others. It requires you to love them wisely rather than just sentimentally. The emperor who can maintain authentic relationships while exercising principled judgment has found the key to leadership that serves both human connection and lasting purpose. In my final years as emperor, when I could feel my strength waning, and knew that my time to influence the empire was drawing to a close, I became obsessed with a question that had haunted me throughout my reign. What kind of foundation was I leaving for the generations who would follow? This concern with legacy transformed from an abstract philosophical concept into the most practical consideration guiding every major decision. The awakening came during a conversation with my chief architect about a bridge we were building across the Danube. He showed me detailed plans that would create a crossing sufficient for current military needs. Solid, functional, built to last perhaps 50 years. But as I studied the drawings, I realized this thinking was too small for an emperor. We weren't just building for current needs. We were building for an empire that I hoped would endure for centuries. I ordered him to redesign the bridge with materials and methods that would support not just our current legions, but armies twice their size, carrying equipment we couldn't yet imagine. The cost was substantially higher, the construction time much longer, but the result was infrastructure that could serve Rome for generations. This decision became my model for what I called imperial time, thinking beyond your own reign toward the empire you want to leave behind. Legacy thinking required me to distinguish between policies that would make my reign look successful and policies that would actually strengthen the empire long term. These were often different things. Popular measures that enhanced my immediate reputation, reducing taxes, increasing public entertainment, avoiding difficult reforms, might win contemporary approval, while weakening the foundations future emperors would depend on. I remember facing intense pressure to reduce military spending after several years of relative peace on the frontiers. Senators argued that the money could be better spent on public works that would make citizens happier and my reign more memorable. The political logic was compelling, but the imperial logic was different. I knew that military strength was what allowed peace to exist, and that the moment we appeared weak, every barbarian tribe on our borders would test our resolve. I maintained military investment even when it was unpopular, even when critics accused me of preferring war to peace. The decision proved wise when new threats emerged from Germanic tribes who had been quietly building alliances and strength while we debated budget allocations. The legions I had maintained, despite political pressure, were what preserved the empire during those crucial years. This experience taught me that imperial thinking requires the courage to be misunderstood by your contemporaries in service of people who don't yet exist. Future Romans could not vote in current elections or voice opinions in current Senate debates, but their needs were just as real as those of living citizens. The emperor who considers only present voices will build an empire that serves today. While failing tomorrow, I began systematically evaluating every major policy through what I called the generational test. How would this decision affect the empire in 20 years, in 50 years, in a century? This didn't mean I ignored immediate needs, but it meant I weighted long-term consequences more heavily than short-term comfort when the two came into conflict. The test proved especially valuable in judicial and legal matters. When establishing legal precedents, I had to consider not just whether they resolved current disputes fairly, but whether they would guide future emperors toward justice or away from it. Laws that seemed reasonable for immediate circumstances might create dangerous precedents if applied to different situations by less wise successors. I remember a case involving provincial taxation, where the obvious solution was to grant special exemptions to regions experiencing temporary economic difficulties. The immediate effect would have been relief for suffering citizens and gratitude for imperial mercy. But I realized that this precedent might encourage future provinces to exaggerate their problems to gain similar exemptions, ultimately undermining the tax system that funded imperial services. Instead, I created systematic relief procedures that required objective documentation of need and automatic sunset, provisions that prevented temporary measures from becoming permanent entitlements. This approach provided the same immediate relief, while protecting the long-term integrity of imperial finances. Legacy thinking also influenced my approach to personnel development. Instead of surrounding myself with advisors who made my current job easier, I invested time in training people who could strengthen the imperial system, regardless of who succeeded me. I established formal mentorship programs for promising administrators, created systematic rotation policies that gave commanders experience in diverse challenges, and documented institutional knowledge that wouldn't die with individual leaders. Perhaps most importantly, I focused on establishing systems and institutions rather than depending on exceptional individuals. While personal greatness was valuable, an empire that required heroic leaders to function effectively would eventually fail when ordinary leaders inherited power. I worked to create governmental structures that could produce good outcomes, even when operated by people of average ability and virtue. This institutional focus led me to codify many informal practices that had depended on imperial wisdom or benevolence: procedures for provincial appeals, standards for military promotions, guidelines for judicial decisions. Systematized these processes so that future emperors would inherit not just power, but the frameworks for using that power wisely. The most difficult aspect of legacy thinking was accepting that I could not control how my successors would use what I left them. I could build strong institutions, but I couldn't guarantee that future emperors would respect them. I could establish wise precedents, but I couldn't prevent future leaders from overturning them. I could prepare capable successors, but I couldn't ensure they would make good decisions. This uncertainty taught me to focus on what I could influence the foundation, rather than the specific building that would be constructed upon it. I worked to create systems so robust that they could survive some degree of mismanagement, precedents so clearly beneficial that future leaders would hesitate to abandon them, and institutional cultures so strong that they could guide behavior even when formal rules were ignored. My approach to succession planning reflected this philosophy. While I hoped my son Commodus would prove worthy of imperial responsibility, I could not base the empire's future entirely on that hope. I established advisory councils that could guide an inexperienced emperor, created checks and balances that could limit the damage from poor decisions, and strengthened institutions that could maintain essential functions regardless of imperial competence. I also invested heavily in what I called cultural legacy, the values, traditions, and ways of thinking that would influence Roman behavior long after my specific policies were forgotten. Through my writings, my public statements, and my personal example, I tried to reinforce the philosophical principles that had guided my reign: service over self-interest, long-term thinking over short-term advantage, principled leadership over popular appeal. Near the end of my life, as I reviewed the empire I was preparing to leave behind, I measured success not by how well things were functioning during my reign, but by how well they were positioned to function without me. The institutions that could adapt to new challenges, the leaders who thought beyond immediate pressures, the precedents that encouraged wisdom, these were my true monuments, more lasting than any building or military victory. Legacy thinking transformed my understanding of imperial power from a tool for achieving personal goals into a responsibility for stewardship. I was not the owner of the empire, but its temporary caretaker, accountable not just to current citizens, but to all the generations who would inherit what I left behind. This perspective made every decision more weighty but also more meaningful, because I knew that wise choices today could benefit people for centuries to come. Remember, whatever authority you exercise, whatever influence you possess, think beyond your immediate tenure toward the foundation you're laying for those who will follow. The leader who builds only for his own success creates temporary achievements. The leader who builds for future generations creates lasting transformation. Think like an emperor who knows his reign will end, but whose impact can endure forever. As I observe your modern world from the perspective of ancient wisdom, I see that the fundamental challenges of leadership remain unchanged. Whether you're managing a business team or a household, whether you're navigating corporate politics or family dynamics, whether you're building a career or building a community, the principles of imperial thinking apply with the same force they had 2,000 years ago. The emperor's mindset is not about commanding armies or ruling provinces. It's about taking complete responsibility for your sphere of influence, while maintaining the mental discipline to make wise decisions under pressure. Every person today has some domain where they exercise authority, face difficult choices, and influence others' well-being. In these areas, you can think and act like an emperor regardless of your formal title or position. Consider the modern manager, facing budget cuts that require eliminating positions. The reactive approach is to make decisions based on immediate pressure, protecting favorites, avoiding confrontation, or simply cutting the most expensive roles. The imperial approach is to apply the same principles I used when deciding which provinces would receive limited resources during the plague: objective analysis of long-term value, fair consideration of all affected parties, and clear communication about difficult realities. The inner citadel that protected my peace of mind during barbarian invasions can protect your mental stability during workplace conflicts or family crises. When colleagues undermine your projects, when market conditions threaten your business, when personal relationships create stress, you can retreat to that inner fortress where your essential self remains untouchable by external circumstances. Discipline of desire that helped me find contentment while ruling an empire can help you find satisfaction in whatever circumstances you face. Instead of making your happiness dependent on getting promotions, acquiring possessions, or controlling other people's behavior, you can learn to want what happens while working skillfully toward what you prefer. This doesn't mean becoming passive, it means becoming internally free while remaining externally effective. The view from above that gave me perspective during imperial crises can transform how you handle daily pressures. When your problems feel overwhelming, step back mentally and see them in larger context. Will this setback matter in 5 years? How does this challenge compare to what others throughout history have faced? What opportunities might be hidden within this apparent obstacle? The principles of justice that guided my legal decisions can guide your personal and professional choices. Before making any significant decision, ask, is this fair to all affected parties? Am I treating similar situations consistently? Am I applying the same standards to myself that I expect from others? Would I be comfortable if everyone in similar situations acted the same way? The courage that enabled me to make unpopular but necessary imperial decisions can enable you to take right action when it's difficult. Whether you're confronting an underperforming employee, ending a destructive relationship, or pursuing an unpopular but important goal, the same mental courage that sustained emperors can sustain you through temporary discomfort toward lasting improvement. Modern technology creates new contexts, but doesn't change fundamental human nature. The senator who spread malicious rumors in my court is the same type of person who spreads damaging gossip in your office. The provincial governor who prioritized personal gain over public service is the same type of leader who prioritizes short-term profits over long-term sustainability. The advisor who told me what I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to hear is the same type of person who avoids difficult conversations in your organization. Your daily challenges may seem smaller than those I faced as emperor, but they require the same fundamental qualities: the wisdom to see situations clearly, the justice to treat people fairly, the courage to act rightly despite pressure, and the temperance to use your power moderately. A parent disciplining a child, a teacher managing a classroom, a business owner making strategic decisions, all can benefit from imperial thinking. The practice of present moment awareness that helped me focus during military campaigns can help you focus during business meetings, difficult conversations, or any situation requiring clear thinking. Instead of mentally rehearsing what you want to say next or worrying about potential outcomes, give complete attention to what is actually happening right now. This presence of mind dramatically improves decision-making and relationship quality. The mortality meditation that clarified my priorities as emperor can clarify your priorities as well. Regularly remind yourself that your time is limited, your opportunities finite, your influence temporary. This awareness doesn't create morbid thinking, it creates focused thinking. What matters enough to deserve your limited time and energy? What legacy do you want to leave in your sphere of influence? The long-term thinking that guided my policy decisions can guide your strategic choices. Before accepting a job, making a major purchase, or entering a relationship, consider not just immediate benefits, but long-term consequences. How will this choice affect your life in 5 years? What kind of future are you building with today's decisions? The relationship principles that helped me maintain authentic connections despite imperial power can help you maintain meaningful relationships despite modern pressures. Learn to separate your feelings about people from your evaluation of their performance. Practiced principled love, caring for people while holding them accountable to appropriate standards. Create spaces where relationships can exist apart from professional or financial considerations. The systems thinking that led me to build institutions rather than depending on exceptional individuals can improve any organization you influence. Instead of trying to solve problems through personal heroics, create processes and procedures that produce good outcomes, regardless of who implements them. Build systems that can function effectively even when you're not personally managing every detail. Perhaps most importantly, adopt the imperial perspective that your authority, whatever its scope, exists to serve something larger than your personal comfort or advantage. Whether you're leading a family, a team, a company, or a community organization, approach that responsibility as a stewardship rather than an opportunity for self-benefit. The emperor's burden of making decisions that affect others' lives translates directly to modern leadership challenges. Every manager's decision affects their team's well-being. Every parent's choice influences their children's development. Every citizen's vote impacts their community's future. With authority comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes the opportunity to think and act like an emperor. Start with daily practices that build imperial mental habits. Morning reflection to set intentions. Evening review to extract lessons. Regular reading to expand perspective. Physical discipline to strengthen will, and meditation to develop inner stability. These simple practices, pursued consistently, will gradually transform your thinking from reactive to proactive, from self-focused to service-oriented, from short-term to long-term. Remember, you don't need a crown or a throne to think like an emperor. You need only the commitment to use whatever influence you have in service of principles larger than yourself, to make decisions based on wisdom rather than impulse, and to accept responsibility for the consequences of your choices. The imperial mindset is available to anyone willing to embrace its challenges and rewards. The moment has come for you to begin your own imperial transformation. Everything I have shared, every practice, every hard-won insight, from my 19 years as emperor now, rests in your hands like a torch passed from one generation to another. The question is not whether you have the capacity to think like an emperor. The question is whether you have the commitment to begin. Let me tell you what this transformation requires, because I will not mislead you with promises of easy change. Developing an imperial mindset demands the same dedication that building any worthwhile capability requires. You must practice daily, fail regularly, adjust constantly, and persist despite setbacks. The philosopher-emperor is not born but forged through conscious effort over time. Begin each morning with what I call the emperor's intention. A few minutes of reflection before the day's demands consume your attention. Ask yourself, what does this day require of me? How can I serve something larger than my immediate comfort? What decisions will I face that deserve my highest thinking? This morning, practice creates a foundation of purposefulness that can sustain you through whatever challenges emerge. Throughout your day, apply the imperial pause before any significant decision. Take 3 conscious breaths and ask, what would wisdom require here? What would serve the greater good? What choice will I be proud of when the immediate pressure passes? This brief practice prevents reactive decisions and cultivates the thoughtful response that characterizes imperial thinking. When facing difficult people or frustrating situations, remember the view from above. Step back mentally and see the current challenge in larger context. This person who is creating problems for you is dealing with their own struggles, fears, and limitations. This setback that seems so significant is one moment in a much larger story. This pressure that feels overwhelming is temporary, while the character you build by responding wisely is permanent. Practice the discipline of desire by regularly choosing what happens rather than demanding that circumstances align with your preferences. This doesn't mean becoming passive, but it means finding peace with reality while working skillfully to improve it. When traffic delays your schedule, when projects don't unfold as planned, when people disappoint your expectations, practice wanting even these experiences because they provide opportunities to develop patience, adaptability, and grace under pressure. Cultivate legacy thinking by considering the long-term impact of your choices. Before making any major decision, ask, how will this affect my life in 5 years? What kind of example does this set for others? If everyone in similar situations acted this way, would the result benefit or harm society? This perspective elevates your decision-making from immediate self-interest to lasting contribution. Develop present moment mastery by training your attention to remain focused on current reality rather than drifting into past regrets or future anxieties. When listening to others, listen completely. When working on tasks, work with full attention. When experiencing moments of joy or beauty, experience them fully. The emperor who masters the present moment has access to all his resources and abilities. Build your inner citadel through daily practices that strengthen mental resilience. Read philosophy that challenges comfortable assumptions. Exercise physically to build discipline and stress tolerance. Meditate regularly to develop the ability to observe your thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. Practice voluntary discomfort occasionally to reduce dependence on external circumstances for peace of mind. Apply justice as the highest virtue by treating all people with fairness and dignity regardless of how they treat you. Give credit where credit is due. Accept responsibility for your mistakes. Listen to criticism with an open mind. Keep promises even when circumstances make them inconvenient. Defend those who cannot defend themselves. Make decisions based on principles rather than politics. Exercise courage in leadership by taking right action, even when it's difficult or unpopular. Have conversations that need to happen. Make decisions that serve long-term benefit despite short-term cost. Stand up for principles even when standing alone. Admit mistakes even when denial would be easier. Take responsibility for outcomes even when you could blame others. Practice temperance in power by using whatever authority you have, moderately rather than maximally. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Just because you have access to pleasures doesn't mean you should pursue them. Just because you can control others doesn't mean you should micromanage them. The disciplined use of power multiplies its effectiveness. Most importantly, remember that imperial thinking is not about perfection, but about sincere effort to apply these principles consistently over time. You will make mistakes. You will fall short of your ideals. You will face situations where the right choice is unclear or where all available options have significant drawbacks. This is the nature of leadership and the reason why developing wisdom is a lifelong process. When you fail, and you will fail, treat the failure as education rather than condemnation. Ask what the setback can teach you about improving your judgment, strengthening your character, or adjusting your approach. The emperor who learns from mistakes serves the empire better than the emperor who never makes mistakes but also never grows. Surround yourself with people who will support your commitment to these principles. Seek out advisors who will tell you difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. Find mentors who exemplify the qualities you want to develop. Build relationships with people who share your commitment to service over self-interest, long-term thinking over short-term advantage, principle over convenience. Read regularly from sources that reinforce imperial thinking. Study history to see how others have faced similar challenges. Read philosophy to sharpen your reasoning and clarify your values. Read biography to learn from both the successes and failures of great leaders. Feed your mind with content that elevates your thinking rather than distracting from serious purposes. Create systems in your life that support imperial behavior. Establish routines that include reflection, planning, and review. Design your environment to minimize temptations that lead away from your principles. Build accountability structures that help you maintain commitments when motivation wanes. Make it easier to act like an emperor and harder to act impulsively. Remember that imperial thinking scales to whatever domain you influence. Whether you're managing a household or a corporation, whether you're leading a volunteer organization or a government agency, whether you're responsible for 3 people or 3,000, these principles can guide your decision-making and enhance your effectiveness. The transformation begins now with your very next choice. You can read these words as interesting historical curiosities and return to your previous patterns of thinking and acting, or you can read them as practical tools for becoming the kind of leader your circumstances require and your principles demand. I challenge you to spend the next 30 days consciously applying one imperial principle each day. Start with whichever principle resonates most strongly with your current challenges. Practice it deliberately. Notice the results. Adjust your approach based on what you learn. After 30 days, add another principle. After 60 days, add a third. Build your imperial mindset gradually but persistently. The world needs people who think like emperors, not because it needs more authority or power, but because it needs more wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance in positions of influence. Every organization, every community, every family can benefit from someone who approaches responsibility with imperial seriousness and imperial commitment to service. You have received the wisdom of centuries. You now possess tools that guided one of history's greatest civilizations through its challenges and triumphs. The only question remaining is what you will do with this inheritance. The emperor within you is waiting to emerge. The moment you begin thinking beyond your immediate comfort toward your lasting contribution, beyond your personal advantage toward the greater good, beyond your current problems, toward your ultimate potential in that moment, your imperial transformation begins. Rise to meet your responsibilities with the dignity they deserve. Accept your authority with the seriousness it requires. Use your influence with the wisdom it demands. Think like an emperor and watch as your life transforms from ordinary existence into extraordinary service. The empire you build may not span continents or last for centuries, but it will endure in the lives you touch, the examples you set, and the legacy you leave. That is the true measure of imperial greatness, and it is within your reach starting now. Go forth and think like an emperor. The world is waiting for your leadership.